Friends, we're going to get started here in a few minutes. If you don't mind finding a seat. This is your 1-minute warning. All right, it's time for our Tuesday afternoon plenary. I'm grateful to Dr. Thomas Schatauer for introducing our plenary speaker. Tom?
It's my privilege to introduce Dr. Terra Schwerin Rowe, who's professor of religion and ecology at the University of North Texas in Denton, Texas. Terra has been on an intellectual journey that has led her into serious reflection about the role of our theological traditions and the ecological crisis of our time. Most intellectual journeys have their roots in things personal and how that unfolds throughout a life. So I wonder if her name has something to do with the trajectory of this journey. Terra derives from the Latin for earth or land. It's at least certainly appropriate for her concern for the earth, its well-being, and human thriving in this world that is our common home. Terra began her journey at Luther College and then at Wartburg Seminary about 20 years ago, where she received an MA in diaconal ministry and wrote a thesis entitled Hermeneutic of the Cross, a contemporary reading of Luther's theology of the cross as a hermeneutic of life. I think we might see there already the beginning of her concern for life on earth. And as you know, Luther's theology of the cross begins by calling a thing what it is. And there was at least one professor who emphasized that at Wartburg again and again. Genuine life comes from acknowledging the truth about who we are, the truth about our world. From Wartburg, Terra went to the Lutheran Theological School at Philadelphia, where she did another master's degree. And there wrote a thesis entitled Lutheran Feminist Ethics, where at least I would see her concern for human gender, matters of gender and human thriving coming to the fore. And she says that this study of feminist theology opened her then to the environmental concerns that she started to pursue. Then to Drew University, where she wrote a dissertation. Lots of writing involved in all of this. which was titled Toward a Better Worldliness: Ecology, Economy, and the Protestant Tradition, which I hear as a critique of Protestant tradition in relation to the environment and our economic life, but also a proposal for something better, a better worldliness. All of this leads to the range of her teaching and research interests as a professor at a public university, the University of North Texas. And her most recent book shows the integration of all these interests, and it's titled Of Modern Extraction, Critical Experiments in Petrotheology, and it concerns gender, energy, and theology. You've likely seen her picture and bio in the Institute materials. And one thing I noted right away, and I've known since I've known her at Warburg, that she is a joyful presence. So I asked her the other day if the evidence of her joy in her demeanor is accurate reading of her. And she said, yes, and that the current environment in which we live is a stressful one in which to teach truth about who we are and the world that we live in. And I think we should all recognize that professors at universities, and maybe especially public universities, are being watched now all the time for what they say, how they say it, what they teach, what they say about what they're teaching. And I think this is going to be especially acute for anyone who takes Luther's theology of the cross seriously, that we have to at least begin by acknowledging the truth about who we are and what our world is, to call a thing what it is. By all accounts, Terra, you are a superb teacher, and we here are ready to hear what you have to say to us. So please welcome Dr. Terra Schwerin Rowe.
Thank you so much, Thomas. It's been really meaningful to be back here. This is, I think, probably my third time at the Liturgical Institute. It's been about 12 years or something, but it's been especially meaningful to be back here and to see some of my Wartburg seminary folks, and to be around for Thomas to get his award last night was just really meaningful. All right. Okay, so I'd like to start with a little Paul. In 1 Corinthians, Paul articulates the heart of the Christian message. For I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable. What is raised is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown in a physical body. It is raised in a spiritual body. If there is a physical body, there is also a spiritual body. 1 Corinthians 15. So Christ died, Christ was risen, so we too, inasmuch as we share in Christ's death, will share in his life and be raised. Paul here uses natural metaphors to proclaim the gospel. The Christian is a seed planted. We are sown, buried under the ground, raised to new life in astonishing beauty and astounding glory. Early Christians, too, took this metaphor seriously. Macrina, for example, as recorded by her brother St. Gregory of Nyssa in On the Soul of and Resurrection, repeats the metaphor of the Christian as a seed planted and raised to new life. Clearly, these organic, verdant metaphors have spoken to Christians in various times and places. But what does this message mean in particular for current life and ongoing climate crisis turned polycrisis? When extreme weather, reckless politics, and exploitative economic practices converge in such a way to create conditions of precarity, death, violence, and loss for so many human and more than human creatures. Today, I'd like to outline a common theologically infused diagnosis of this environmental crisis. I'd like to explain why I think that particular diagnosis and theological intervention isn't particularly applicable when it comes to energy and extraction, and propose modes of resistance to extraction enchantments. So we'll take this in three parts. First, analyzing environmental destruction as disenchantment. Secondly, focusing on extraction and enchantment, including what I'll introduce as petrotheology. And third, modes of resisting extraction enchantments in liturgical practice. So, part one. Especially within the spheres of religion and environmentalism, many have emphasized that the environmental crisis is not just rooted in economic, resource policy, or infrastructural problems, but it is also rooted in a spiritual or moral crisis. In particular, a loss of meaning and shared values in the modern world. Where ancient and medieval people, by contrast, could have experienced God in nature or found value in nature beyond its utility, modern people, according to this narrative, have lost that ability. Many, in other words, articulate the problem currently faced in terms of disenchantment. The condition of the world once science, enlightenment, rationalism have eroded the power of religion and superstition. The term disenchantment is credited to the German sociologist Max Weber in a 1918 lecture. Weber's term was actually Entzauberung, which literally means demagication, or the breaking of a magic spell. For Weber, the advent of scientific method and use of enlightened reasons meant that the world was rendered transparent and demystified. It implies a sense of faith and reason in science to explain everything on rational terms. So for Weber, this demagication was important and even necessary, a result of the rationalization of both science and capitalism. But he also mourned the loss of a sense of mystery and richness in the world. I think what Weber was experiencing here is what we might say akin to something like adulting, right? Disenchantment is a necessary step, one often accompanied by also a sense of loss, a sense of nostalgia, a kind of mourning, loss of innocence or playful freedom. So tracing the environmental crisis to a modern condition of disenchantment is a broadly held narrative among religious and non-religious thinkers. Many, for example, trace the beginnings of ecotheology to someone who may be very familiar to several of us in this room, Joseph Sittler. American Lutheran pastor talking about religion and ecology as early as the 1950s. Sittler emphasized that ancient Christians, he was thinking here in particular of Irenaeus and his Against Heresies, saw doctrines of creation and salvation, nature and grace, as inherently linked. But modern Christians, by contrast, in 20th century Protestantism in particular, he had Bardian neo-orthodoxy in mind, have separated nature and grace, such that grace or redemption is frequently theorized as antithetical to or an interruption of nature. Sittler focuses on the false separation of theologies of redemption and theologies of creation, more commonly interpreted as an emphasis on saving human souls with no connection to redemption of the wider earth. In other words, Sittler would say that we've lost the sense conveyed by Paul in 1 Corinthians of divine grace and redemption articulated only within the scope and matrix of creation. To resist this tendency, Sittler emphasized a cosmic Christology, a sense that creation has been effected in and through Christ, and redemption is a return of all things to Christ, to communion with God through Christ. Though very different in approach and conclusions, medieval historian of technology Lynn White Jr. also tied environmental crisis to a kind of disenchantment. White is famous or infamous for his 1967 thesis that Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion the world has ever seen, that Western Christian belief is and its divine mandate to have dominion over the world has encouraged the eradication of animisms that held to the inherent worth and sacrality of nature. U.S. Roman Catholic priest Thomas Berry also echoed themes articulated by Sittler, White, and many other eco-theologians. Environmental problems, he said, are not just economic, practical, or technological, but a result of a lack of loss of meaning and a loss of spirituality. Berry articulated an old story of Christianity that no longer was functioning. That old story was Christians saved outside of the world, and he emphasized that this was a narrative that no longer functioned in the modern context, and therefore for a need for a new story, one that can unite modern scientific ways of knowing with proper morality and ethics to direct this engagement of knowledge. These three examples are just the tip of a much larger iceberg of religiously informed approaches to environmental crisis that center around a disenchantment narrative. Other examples are Alistair McGrath's Re-enchanting Nature, Jim Wallace's Christianity and Animism and the Re-enchantment of the World. There are just a few other examples up here. These figures have different diagnoses of the root problems of the environmental crisis and quite different proposed antidotes to those problems. But what they share is a common sense that with the emergence of modern science and capitalism, modern folks have lost an important sense of nature as enchanted, as sacred, as having worth beyond its utility. As antidote, many have proposed the importance of re-enchanting or re-sacralizing the natural world. And this is a narrative that is not just particular to religious folks, but to even non-religious folks as well. So for example, this is a quote from Jane Bennett in her book, The Enchantment of Modern Life. Jane Bennett is a new materialist thinker, not a religious thinker, and this articulates this kind of ethos of disenchantment really well. She writes, "There was once a time when nature was purposive. God was active in the details of human affairs. Human and other creatures were defined by a pre-existing web of relations. Social life was characterized by face-to-face relations, and political order took the form of organic community. Then this pre-modern world gave way to forces of scientific and instrumental rationality, secularism, individualism, and the bureaucratic state, all of which combined disenchant the world." So inasmuch as religions will find, kind of rediscover a sense of the sacred and integrate that back into their practices, they will enter into what Mary Evelyn Tucker calls the ecological age of religions. She writes her own kind of framing that I would identify also as a disenchantment narrative, can be identified in this quote. She writes, "Religions have traditionally been a means of expanding the measure of the mind through the power of the religious imagination. Now is the moment," and this is kind of her re-enchantment move, "for the religions to move forward boldly with comprehensive narrative perspectives that are grounded in relevant traditional resources, to open to a sense of wonder and guided by inspiring moral visions for shaping human-earth relations for sustainability." So for Tucker, as for many other ecotheologians, the power of religion is in reestablishing a lost sense of divinity, sacrality, wonder, or an enchantment that could foster clearer environmental ethics. Similarly, for Sittler and other Protestant ecotheologians like Jürgen Moltmann and Paul Santmeyer, the key theological move will be to re-emphasize, with Paul in 1 Corinthians, the false separation of theologies of creation from theologies of redemption, of divine grace from nature, and reintegrating grace and redemption within the scope of a divine, ongoing story of creation. Okay, part 2. So I've been looking at extraction and energy practices since about 2018 when I moved to Texas. Everything from the beginning of modern mining in Saxony during the Reformation, to extraction and colonization in South America, to modern energy sciences in the 1850s, to early oil extraction narratives from the 19th to the 21st century. And what I have found is that while the disenchantment thesis rings true, especially with regard to the treatments of indigenous peoples and their lifeways, when it comes to energy and extraction, these practices were and often continue to be profoundly enchanted. Relatedly, contrary to those who would tie environmentally destructive practices like extraction to a loss of integration of redemption theologies within the scope of creation, most of the extraction narratives that I have found, from the Reformation to scholastic logics of extraction in the Americas to electrical and petrotheologies, have clearly articulated pro-extractivist redemptive aims articulated within the scope of creation theologies. So let's look at some examples of the environmental impacts of enchantment and theologies of extractivism. Let's look first at the term resource. Rather than being devoid of religious content or articulating a theology of redemption outside of or counter to a creation theology, resource is a profoundly theological concept, tied precisely to the seed metaphor Paul outlined in 1 Corinthians. In fact, the word resource has its etymological roots in resurrection. The Latin root is resurgere, to rise up, resurrect, get up, or recover. And this applied especially to minerals, which in the early modern period were theorized to grow organically. Echoing the early Christian metaphor for resurrection as a seed planted in the earth, growing to a new body of new life, minerals were seen as seeds planted by God from the beginning of the world, with extraction as a kind of resurrection, a raising of minerals to the redemptive, fulfilled purpose. A resource then was something that had been planted by God, something intended for human use, with its resurrection fulfillment found at the height of its usefulness for humans. We see this influencing Reformation-era mining theologies, scholastic mining logics, and 19th century oil narratives. Let's look first at the Saxony mining boom. The Saxony mining boom rose to new heights in the 1500s in the time and context of the Reformation. I don't know about you, but I've studied a lot of Reformation history and theology, but it had never been made particularly clear to me that the mining boom that is considered to be the start of modern mining happened in Saxony in the precise time and geographical location of the Reformation. In 1550, Georgis Agricola, a Roman Catholic living in Protestant Chemnitz and friendly with several reformers like Melanchthon, published De Re Metallica, a text that is considered to mark the beginning of modern mining. If we take this historical context seriously, it seems important to examine the ways mining and the Reformation informed one another. One particularly interesting case study is Lutheran pastor Johannes Matthias. He lived in Joachimthal, in current-day Czech Republic on the border with Germany, and witnessed the rapid changes brought about by mining. A successful mining venture, which he attributes to wisdom gained from Agricola, allowed him opportunity to travel to Wittenberg, to be trained and ordained by Luther as a pastor, and then be sent back to, in 1545, as pastor to miners. We have evidence of his extraction theologies in the form of a mining treatise for Luther and the other reformers at Wittenberg. His Caestio de Rebus Metallicis was, as well as a published collection of sermons to miners, the Serepta oder Burg Postil, or Sermons on the Mount. In these texts, Matthias portrayed mining and the Protestant event as wholly intertwined with God's providential aims for the world. He believed in the organic development of minerals, like plants and animals. They were theorized to develop from one form to their fully perfected form over time with application of heat. And so he theorized that God planted minerals as seeds from the beginning of time, leaving them to come to their full development at the divinely appointed moment. Matthias also believed he was clearly living in a divinely appointed moment. Just as underdeveloped minerals sat in the earth being perfected over time, so too the gospel message had been proclaimed and then was buried, lay in wait, being perfected over time only to emerge when the reformers mined it and brought it to the light of day. For Matthias, the correspondence of the mining boom and the Reformation were not happenstance. Their simultaneity revealed a providential plan. Both the mining boom and the Protestant movement together served as evidence that he was living in a time when God's influence was the strongest, when the divine plan was finally coming to fruition. So in this instance, in the entwined birth of modern mining in the context of the Reformation, mining is not devoid of the sacred, nor is it portrayed in ways that cut off creation theologies from redemption. In Matthias's case, they remained fully integrated. With modern mining in Saxony, we see marked turns towards extractive logics and increasingly efficient methods. But as Matthias's case demonstrates, at least at this early stage, those who benefited from mining could include relatively common folk like Matthias himself. In addition, while labor could be exploitative, miners in Saxony did have the benefit of the protection from guilds. By contrast, mining in the New World of the Americas entailed not just exploitation, but enslavement and brutal labor demands. The two sites, though, are not historically disconnected. Just 10 years after the publication of Agricola's text, we find the Italians, the Brits, the Spaniards have embraced Agricola's text and put its knowledge to work. This is particularly the case of Potosi in current-day Bolivia. Potosi was founded as a mining town in 1554 in the shadow of what became known as Cerro Rico, or Rich Mountain. The global significance of Potosi mines is staggering. Between 1550 and 1500 and 1800, silver mines from South America produced as much as 136,000 tons of silver, what amounted to, at the time, 80% of global production. On account of the scale of extraction of silver in particular, some scholars consider Potosi the first city of capitalism, and that it supplied silver at a scale necessary for global exchange of coins. In Potosi, we have reports of Agricola's Saxony mining text being profoundly helpful, if not revered. One of Potosi's mining engineers most frequently referenced resources was Agricola's De Re Metallica. Knowing how frequently the text was needed for reference, priests literally chained Agricola's text to the Eucharistic table as a way of continually reminding the miners of the sacredness of their work. What's more, scholastic theories of mineral development and mining continued the ancient Greek philosophical and Christian association of minerals with seeds. For example, in Padre Barba's De Re Metallica, the first study of mineralogy in the Americas, and a text clearly inspired by Agricola's, minerals were theorized to have the capacity for self-generation, just as did plants and vegetables. Barba and Spanish jurists argued that minerals grew cyclically and organically in the same pattern as agricultural products. Since legally Spain had right to any agricultural products, it was determined that not just the products above ground, but also those below ground were owned by the crown. Scholastic theories of mineral development built from ancient Aristotelian theories of primary matter as amorphous plastic raw material with no consistency of its own. This matter remains unintelligible potential until actualized in its given form. From this perspective, both unextracted minerals and indigenous Americans alike were theorized to be unruly matter in need of the formation to reach their perfected instrumental forms. Just as the raw matter of minerals was identified as imperfect matter in need of perfection that would be found in their extraction and refinement, so too indigenous Americans were not dead or inert matter, but unruly, imperfect matter that was yet plastic, moldable, and so in need of the perfecting agency of Spanish rule, Christian religion, and forced labor. While Potosi Mountain was known to Europeans as Cerro Rico, the Quechua indigenous to the area had another name for it. As those who were forced to supply the labor for Potosi mines, they knew this place as the mountain that eats men. The labor conditions were beyond brutal. 3 to 4 days at a time were the kind of cycles that they spent in underground work. 6 to 8 years was the expected working life of an enslaved Potosi miner in order to meet the daily quota of 25 bags or around 100 pounds of silver ore. Writings at the time report that, quote, if 20 healthy Indians enter on Monday, half emerge crippled on Saturday. So while the environmental and social justice issues will, I expect, be evident, what I want to emphasize again is that they did not occur based on a separation of creation from redemption, since the redemptive perfecting of matter depended on theories of creation as generation that required the perfecting molding towards redemptive ends. And neither did they rely on a loss of enchantment or internal material agency. Recall that minerals were seen to have an innate capacity for growth and regeneration, and so an internal vitality. So modern extraction have relied on enduring and new enchantments rather than a loss of enchantment, as well as integrated rather than separated theologies of creation and redemption. What now about energy? Let's look first at the ancient term energeia, which, as we'll see in a bit, is directly influential for modern energy science. Aristotle came up with the term energeia, building from a distinction that Plato had made between the mere possession of a thing and the use of a thing in possession. Aristotle defined these as energeia, or the use of a thing, or as David Bradshaw translates, the exercise of a capacity. Something possessed so that it could be used, by contrast, was potentia. So Aristotle differentiates the term from potentia, that is possessed but not being used. He differentiates also from kinesis, or motion, and metabole, or change. Aristotle specifies that energeia is different from these other terms because it's meant to signify the exercise of a capacity that is complete in its act. It doesn't describe an ongoing process or something that will one day be completed, but something fulfilled in its enactment. Aristotle differentiates energeia from other terms using the metaphor of building a house. Building a house requires potentia, kinesis, metabole, but for Aristotle, not energeia, because it's not an activity that is complete in its enactment. He says, when one is building a house, it is not at the same time built. The example, by contrast, that Aristotle gives for energeia is sight. When one sees, one at the same time has seen. Unlike building a house, seeing is complete in its activity. Other examples, then, that Aristotle gives of actions that are complete in their activity are thinking, understanding, living well, and flourishing. Fulfillment or completion is such a key part of this term, what this term signifies for Aristotle, that at times and especially his later interpreters, uses it interchangeably with entelechie. Ancient thinkers readily took up Aristotle's term, and early Christians were no exception. Starting with St. Paul in his letters that became part of the New Testament, he relies on Aristotle's neologism and applies it in a way that, according to philosopher David Bradshaw, was unprecedented among ancient thinkers. While Aristotle and followers use the term broadly to describe a full, complete exercise of a capacity, Paul uses the term solely in reference to spiritual agents or supernatural action. Here, energeia is brought into the exclusive purview of an agent and becomes an instrument or a tool for Paul exclusively of spiritual agents. So Paul links the term also to salvation theology, applying the language of energeia to express a sense of human fulfillment through the embrace of the divine. Paul's restriction and unique usage of the term became influential, and early Christian thinkers followed in his wake. After Paul, for early Christians, energeia was not just the activity or exercise of a capacity, but a capacity associated with the presence of the divine and associated with salvation as human fulfillment. But then how does that affect and impact modern energy? So in calling for and initiating the new science of power and action, or dynamics, 18th century philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz expressly drew on the distinction that Aristotle had made between energeia and potentia to differentiate between vis viva and vis mortua, which roughly corresponds to what we now know as potential and kinetic energy. In the 19th century, the science of dynamics became thermodynamics as scientists and engineers tried to make sense of and make more efficient modern machines and early engines. In the modern sense, energy came to be most commonly defined as the ability to do work, a key kind of reversal of Aristotle. Contrary to most conflict narratives of religion and science, for premier Scottish energy scientists like Lord Kelvin, Peter Guthrie Tait, and James Clerk Maxwell, energy science was not articulated in opposition to their Protestant faith, but was seen as something that confirmed it. In the process, their views of energy were also infused with beliefs about divine power. Energy humanities scholar Kara Daggett emphasizes that in particular their energy science became infused with a Protestant work ethic, notably the value of work as a way of fighting against waste, destruction, decay, and a loss of order. I've argued that this modern emphasis on work was not a clear departure, but also a continuation of ancient patterns of associating energeia with actualization, since work itself serves the purposes of always aiming towards a completion or fulfillment. Where ancient energeia signified completion or fulfillment itself, modern energy builds from a Pauline slide to focus on an agent's use of energy as a tool that aids or leads to human fulfillment. In modernity, energy is no longer fulfillment itself, but something that could be put to work to aid human completion. We see something similar in what historians identify as electrical theologies. Electricity and magnetism emerged in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries as sciences profoundly enchanted. Historians of the time period emphasize that it was common in the 18th and 19th century to attribute godlike powers to electricity as a source of all animation in life. Alessandro Volta, for example, was convinced that he had discovered a life-giving fluid which, with some subtle conditioning, could resurrect the dead. By the 18th and 19th century, in the US, a full-blown electrical theology had developed. Historian Carolyn Marvin asserts that for many, electrical science was treated as an extension of religious revelation, a conclusion upheld by the belief that electricity contained the divine power to bestow life. Furthermore, religion historian Brett Malcolm Granger emphasizes that it was common for writers in the 18th and 19th centuries to ascribe nearly godlike powers to electricity, giving credence and religious weight to electric cures, and reinforcing a sense that electricity acted as an important medium of divine aims for human fulfillment. Granger has recently argued that electrical theologies infused and profoundly influenced the beginnings of U.S. evangelicalism in the First and Second Great Awakenings. It was not uncommon, he points out, for early evangelicals to explicitly describe their conversion experiences in terms of electrified affect, suggesting that these new technologies and sciences were not banishing religiosity, as is commonly held by theories of secularism and modern disenchantment, but creating new forms of it. Just as expressions of energy science, electricity, and magnetism were not squelching but extending the boundaries of religion, so too petroleum created new forms of religion. Oil, first extractable at a commercial scale in the mid-19th century, was first primarily used as a lubricant and illuminant. But it soon was employed as a fuel, and so its reception was reformed by these previous alignments between forms of energy and religious ideas about human fulfillment. Energy humanities scholars use the term petroculture to refer to the way that petroleum has functioned not just as a material and technological force, but has been influenced by and infuses culture in the forms of literature, painting, philosophy, affects, habits, values, expectations, and concepts. To analyze the enduring enchantments of energy concepts and materialities, in my 2022 book of Modern Extraction, I employ the term petrotheology. So this is a term influenced by speculative fiction writer Margaret Atwood in The Year of the Flood, where she writes about a religious group in this fictional tale that merged their theology with religious faith. She calls them the Petrobaptists. Religion scholar Marian Grau has also employed the term petrotheology starting in 2021. I'm using the term to signal the ways that petroleum has been communicated, explained, and historicized in theological terms. In the mid to late 19th century, several histories of the petroleum industry tell the story of petroleum in the scope of salvation history, with moments of creation, fall, redemption, and evangelism. So I use the term to refer to logics of petroleum that take on characteristics of or function as theologies. I also use the term to signal the ways that petro, energy, and technosciences have not functioned as a replacement for religion, but have been employed as a means to extend the boundaries of what counts as religion. Consistently, these petrotheologies tell the story of oil within the scope of creation and redemption of the world. Here, fulfillment narratives of energeia and salvation histories of Christianity find mutual resonance in oil. Reverend S.J. Eaton's petroleum text is one example. Eaton's book was published in 1866, just 7 years after petroleum had first been discovered in his home region of Titusville, Pennsylvania. Eaton's book tells the story of oil as a fulfillment narrative in the scope of a salvation history, complete with moments of fall, creation, fall, and redemption in the present oil booms. Such overlapping narratives also allow for a slide between divine power and the power of oil. In the last chapter, he addresses a remarkable question. Already, 7 years in, people were asking, are we doing this too much, too fast? Will there be a limit to oil? His response is a resounding no. There will be no limit to oil. But his reasoning is even more interesting. In addressing the limits of oil, he references the limits of divine power. There is no limit, surely, to omnipotence. He continues, a new lesson has been taught the world, that God's treasures are inexhaustible and that his hand can never be shortened. In short, trust in divine omnipotence means trust in unlimited oil. Conversely, questioning the limits of oil becomes now tantamount to questioning the limits of God. Just as Eaton narrates oil within the scope of a Christian theology of creation and redemption, in the first comprehensive history of religion and oil in the U.S., Anointed with Oil, How Christianity and Crude Made Modern America, historian Darren Dochuk has emphasized how its earliest discovery in Titusville, oil was consistently hailed as a savior, an agent of God's redeeming action in the world. As the first oil wells aligned with social divisions leading up to the U.S. Civil War, many expressed at the time hopes that petroleum could prove salvific for the country, providing a way out of or beyond war. For many, petroleum registered as a mystical fount that might ease America out of bloodshed and into a new age of peace and prosperity. Oil was to be a healing balm for the body politic, Dochuk writes. In this context, oil emerged as a redemptive Christ figure. Such a petro-incarnational lens can be found in John J. McLaurin's Sketches in Crude Oil, published first in 1896. True to form for traditional theology of redemption, McLaurin starts with the first moments of creation. Mineralogists, he writes, think petroleum was quietly distilling underneath the ground when the majestic fiat went forth, let there be light. In this origin story of petroleum, McLaurin makes clear that wisdom about oil is rooted in the Bible, while more subtly at first encouraging a slippage between the technoscientific narrative of oil and the redemptive Christ figure. The first Star in the East chapter unfolds as a compilation of ancient Eastern textual citations with special emphasis on Hebrew Bible references to oil. While the history being unfolded through biblical references is that of oil, identifying Petro with the Star of the East clearly also encourages slippage between Christ and oil. In McLaurin's poetic prose, the sweeping redemptive impact of petroleum begins in the East and gradually moves west to eventually illuminate the whole world. In poetic prose, a petroleum ideal is a little poetic interlude in his text, serves as a climax, bridging east and west, while completing the alignment of Christ with petroleum. The narrative of this section ends with an exuberant hurrah for Jesus and hurrah for petroleum. Finally, the text also conveys a missiology that grants oil redemptive power on a global scale. Just as with the proclamation of the gospel begun in the East with full intention of global redemption, so too, quote, with John Wesley, petroleum may exultingly explain, the whole earth is my parish. Other petrotheologies were aligned with Christianity, but in a less traditional version. I think I'm going to skip through this pretty quickly, but this is spiritualism, harmonialism, kind of popular versions of Christianity at the time. I can talk more about this later if you'd like. So these are not merely excessive enchantments of earlier modernities. Energy and extraction vitalism continue to inform current forms of petro-exuberance and now climate denialism. Anne Pasek, for example, demonstrates that climate denialism doesn't just rely on the production of doubt, as Naomi Oreskes has so clearly articulated, but it also relies on the celebration of life, liveliness, and vitality, what she calls carbon vitalism. Pasek doesn't focus on the religious dimensions of these vitalisms, but I have emphasized that they clearly are infused with petrotheological affects and logics. Once again, the role of petro as a form of energy that aids human fulfillment easily resonates with Christian creation and redemption narratives. Take, for example, Calvin E. Beisner, leader of an influential think tank that purports Christian stewardship of creation, but actually promotes climate denialism. In 2013, he wrote an op-ed in Christianity Today. He was responding to a previous op-ed written by climate scientist and evangelical Katharine Hayhoe, who had written to convince evangelicals that climate change was an issue of concern for Christians. Beisner, similar to Eaton and McLaurin, ties petro to the central arc of Christian redemption narratives and employs this theological grounding to argue that Christians should not be concerning themselves with limiting oil in light of climate change, but intensifying oil extraction. He writes, I'll get to that in a second. He writes, rather than seeing, rather than seeing fossil fuels as permanent carbon sequestration, we see them, when transformed into energy, as both literally giving life, long and healthy life, to billions of human beings who are not carbon footprints, beautifully picturing the death, burial, and resurrection of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. He continues, stop and think for a moment. Innocent creatures die, are buried, are brought up out of the ground and bring life to others. Haven't you heard that story before? Of course you have. It's the basic summary of the gospel. Christ, who knew no sin but became sin for us that we might be made the righteousness of God in him, died for our sins according to the scriptures. He was buried. He rose again from the dead on the third day according to the scriptures. At death, the human body is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there's also a spiritual body. Thus it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. 1 Corinthians 15. Here, Beisner relies on and even intensifies several petrotheological strategies we've already seen. With Eaton and McLaurin, he places oil within the scope of redemption, within the scope of redemption history, starting with the first moments of creation, through a fall and to human fulfillment and redemption. As we have seen, his explicit reference to Paul's theory of resurrection, the death of the seed given rebirth in the form of a plant, is not an anomaly as applied to geological formation. This theory of mineral growth, informed by the organic metaphor of the seed, as well as theories of salvation where full development meant the ripening of geological form when it was most useful for humanity, has consistently influenced theories of mineral growth from ancient times. Finally, with Eaton's association of divine omnipotence with oil, here Beisner also closely aligns oil and redemption so that he can conclude that carbon sequestration is not just uneconomical, not just illogical, but a denial of the resurrection and thus anti-gospel. This image, by the way, is of an oil mass that was organized by the Austrian oil company for its workers. And it's sumptuously symbolic. I can talk more about it, or you can take a closer look later. But not only do you see the automobile literally integrated into the service, you also see the background of mining symbols of and an oil pump flanking the crucifix. And then closer up, this is a zoom in. You can see the level of detail, of liturgical detail here. Even the candles stand on drill cores. In the case of Beisner, McLaurin, and Eaton, the root problem is clearly not a loss of enchantment. Rather, a sense of divine presence in or through the material world is clearly motivating environmentally destructive pursuits like extraction and oil reliance. Theological understandings of God's working in and through creation toward redemption is even informing climate denialism. The key issue, therefore, isn't so much a loss of the sacred and the need to reassert it, so much as the need to confront and counter paltry visions of the sacred and truncated versions of redemption. So what then is a faithful response to oil and extraction enchantments? Brings us to part 3. So in this last section, I'd like to map out what that faithful response might look like. I'm not a liturgist, but trained as a theologian and a philosopher, and so I'd like to gesture towards some possible liturgical points of intervention. Gestures that I hope trained liturgists like yourselves might build on and flesh out. So I'd like to map out these points of intervention within the scope of the Paschal Triduum, starting with a theology of the cross. One counter-theological voice to petrotheology needs to be a shift from what Luther identified as theology of glory to a theology of the cross. Luther first articulates this distinction in his Heidelberg Disputation in 1518. Thesis 19 writes, "That person does not deserve to be called a theologian who looks upon the invisible things of God as though they were clearly perceptible in those things that have been made." Now, scholars debate the translation of the last phrase because some argue that Luther intends to say is that we can't derive knowledge about God from the material world. And I think that such an anti-empirical approach would clearly be a detriment to theology, a theology that seeks to speak in and to the groaning of creation. But Thesis 20 clarifies that this can't be an adequate conclusion to draw when Luther follows up, quote, "That person deserves to be called a theologian, however, who comprehends the visible and manifest things of God through suffering and the cross." Luther here emphasizes that God is made most manifest to us in suffering and the cross. This is clearly not an anti-empiricism, not an anti-theophany, but an empiricism that employs an interpretive lens, a hermeneutic of the cross. Inasmuch as we perceive divine power and glory in the mighty works of natural resources, we are acting as theologians of glory. By contrast, inasmuch as we are attending to the crucifixions of the world and God's presence among people and nature working therein, we are theologians of the cross. What Beisner and other petrotheologians conveniently overlook is the way fossil fuels have brought life and liveliness to some, but death, extinction, and destruction for many others. Petrotheology overlooks, for example, the fact that for several years, scientists have been describing what they call a sixth mass extinction event, unprecedented since the dinosaurs, and uniquely driven by human activities like anthropogenic or human-caused climate change. Current rates of species loss are marked between 100 and 1,000 times the natural rate of extinction. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity estimates that up to 1 million plant and animal species are facing extinction due to climate change and other human activities. Petrotheologians also overlook the human consequences of fossil fuel-induced climate change, like climate catastrophe-induced conflicts and mass migration. Some of the United States' first climate refugees have been Native American Lutherans from Shishmaref, Alaska. Nearly a decade ago, homes in Shishmaref were being destroyed due to climate change-induced erosion. In an article in Living Lutheran, pastor of Shishmaref Lutheran at the time, Thomas Richter, addresses the politicization of climate change. In an interview, he says, "There is nothing political about our homes collapsing into the ocean or the thinness of sea ice whose thickness we depend on for food and protection from the storms. There's just suffering." Eaton and Beisner's theological mistake, then, is not in claiming to see God's presence in nature, but that they skip over the crucifixions of the world and suggest that God is primarily to be found in glory, power, and strength of oil and energy corporations, skipping over death and destruction. If God is to be found not in power and glory, and if the visible and manifest things of God are to be seen through suffering in the cross, then we cannot simply overlook the collapse of ecosystems, the political and economic manipulations of oil corporations, and the loss of life and livelihoods of those living in extractive zones and climate crisis zones. So I think that the ecotheologians like Joseph Sittler have been right to emphasize the importance of reintegrating creation and redemption in our theologies. But it's also clear that figures from the Reformation to early oil boom have been thinking seriously about God's redemptive work within nature when it comes to resource use. So where Sittler emphasized the importance of thinking together nature and grace, I'd emphasize also the importance of seeing God's redeeming work in the world through the lens of the theology of the cross. In other words, my sense is that we should attend to grace or divine blessing or redemption in the natural world only in as much as it remains a theology of the cross and not one of glory. Our theologies of creation and redemption should call our attention to those places of suffering and loss, not triumphant power and the glories of human ingenuity. Along those lines, we might also reemphasize the liturgical celebration of Holy Saturday and more fully develop theologies of Holy Saturday. I'd like to propose Holy Saturday as a liturgical locus for resisting extractivism. The service offers a ritual way to enter the entire scope of the gospel story from creation, death, and redemption. It's a service that draws us in and asks us to stay in those moments between life and death and draw our attention closer to crucifixions still waiting for a resurrection. I suggest that a theological and liturgical turn to Holy Saturday to address theologies of glory, interpretations of resurrection and resource blessing, while also better responding to increasing instances of climate catastrophe. In Spirit and Trauma, a theology of remaining, theologian Shelley Rambo develops a Holy Saturday theology, and I think it would be crucial for those facing traumas of climate catastrophe. While Rambo has focused on applying a theology of Holy Saturday to providing better pastoral responses to combat soldiers living with PTSD, she also hints at possible environmental implications. In the process of researching for this theology, she traveled to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. In interviews with church and neighborhood leaders who had lived through Katrina in the 9th Ward, Rambo heard a witness not to triumphant life, a glorious redemption of their former lives, or a resilient message of bouncing back from tragedy stronger and more capable. Consistently, she heard witness to what remains. Death persists, she writes. Life is not triumphantly victorious. There's no life after the storm, but only life reconceived through the storm. A Holy Saturday theology is not a glorious resurrection theology. It keeps vigil with those made most vulnerable and suffering from climate change, remains in solidarity with those living in historical and ongoing extractive zones. For those suffering from climate change disasters like hurricanes, fire, and drought, and those contemplating strategies for climate mitigation, Holy Saturday vigilance is not despair, not acceptance of fate, and certainly not a ratification of extractive capitalism's status quo. For those of us facing climate catastrophe, the triumphal resurrection impulse will be to use the loss as a springboard for gain, to build back better. But rather than a triumphant return after trauma and loss, Holy Saturday provides the place, Rambo writes, and the time from which we can find alternative ways of living. I suggest we think of these moments between life and death, Holy Saturday moments, when in the wake of climate catastrophes or loss of livelihood, as times not to rush to a triumphant resurrection or wallow in the loss of crucifixion, but to remain vigilant, prayerful, receiving them as moments to reconceive life through the storm, rather than springing to a better, triumphant, more glorious life after the storm. These are the moments to reorganize ourselves around vibrant and just relationships, around becoming not just consumers, but producers of more just energy systems and infrastructures, around the kinds of energies that sustain human and other human communities on which they depend, around return, repair, and regenerative rather than energy-intensive forms of play, joy, and renewal. These alternative ways of living, reconceived through the storm, would also include what theologian Karen Bray, building from Rambo, calls grave attending. Attending to the death and suffering by keeping vigil with and remaining in solidarity with even non-local siblings who are living in the midst of or at the edge of extractive zones and rising seas. And finally, when the day of resurrection comes, it's important that we be ready to articulate counter-petrotheologies of resurrection as well. A counter-petrotheology of resurrection would need to recall the recapitulation of Christ. Christ is a summation of all things brought into Christ. Here is not just one thing, oil, as symbol and instrument of resurrection, but all things, ocelot, scarab beetle, staghorn coral, monarch butterfly, human migrant, all things, all human and other human creatures drawn up into the life of Christ. As Catherine Keller emphasizes in her Political Theology of the Earth, if Christ sums up all things, then Matthew 25's directive, what you do to the least of these you do to me, takes on new, more than human meaning. Christ, as the summation of all things, reveals petrotheologies of resurrection as limited pretenders of resurrection theology. Where petrotheologies proclaim Christ summed up in oil, a counter-petrotheology reasserts all things from the smallest, the least, the most precarious, summed up in Christ. Today, a theology may call for closer attention to what Métis scholar Zoe Todd calls the weaponization of oil kin. Could a resurrection counter-petrotheology draw our attention to oil as plant and animal life rendered liquid life-death over millennia, not to be instrumentalized, put to work, and weaponized, but to be attended to, kept vigil with, to be in relation with, as sister, brother, cousin, ancestor, who require honoring, remembering, but never glorifying, instrumentalizing, or weaponizing? If Christ truly sums up all things, then what we do to the least of these becomes a central aspect of gospel living. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Terra. We've got a little bit of a break. You've got about 10 minutes before the workshops at 4 o'clock begin. Again, we'll be out in the hallway if you need direction. And if you've never been to the Lutheran Diaconal Association house before, the address is in the program. You can use your phone and your GPS to map your walk over there, or come and find somebody like me who knows where it is. All right, blessings on the rest of your afternoon.